Hello, in this little presentation we're going to take a look at HDR, High Dynamic Range, and we'll have a look at what it is and how we can use it to our benefit. Dynamic range is basically the ratio between the brightest and the darkest parts of the scene. For a camera it's usually considered to be the ratio of saturation to noise, or more specifically the ratio of the intensity that just saturates the camera to the intensity that just lifts the camera response one standard deviation above the camera noise. So in the real world, this dynamic range can be maybe 100,000 to 1 if you're looking at a landscape, or for example in the images we're going to look at inside the cathedral, where you've got bright stained glass windows and deep dark shadows. Now, no camera can yet capture anywhere near 100,000 to 1. So we have to find a way of getting around that. Now, a normal JPEG is what's called an 8-bit image, and we can see up here that it's an RGBA/8. So that means for every pixel in the image is controlled by 3 times 8, 24 bits for each pixel, and this is considered low dynamic range, and it can encode 256 colors or shades. Now it sounds like a lot, but it's really not. Now a raw image is done in 16 bits, which is 3 times 16 is 48, so there's 48 bits for every pixel in the color image. And even despite this, a raw image is still considered low dynamic range, even though the range of values is much higher than an 8-bit image. A 16-bit image can do 65,536 different shades or colors compared to the 256 of an 8-bit. So a raw image certainly gives you a lot more to work with. And when you're converting or processing a raw file, the process involves applying what's called a tonal curve, which compresses the dynamic range of the raw data so that the converted image shows correctly on your low dynamic range monitor or printer. And that's why you have to process a raw image to get it looking halfway right. Now, so by using 16 bits instead of 8 bits, you'll gain precision, but you will not in fact gain dynamic range. To gain the dynamic range, we have to up the ante a bit more, and in this case we go to 32-bit images. So that's got 32 times 3, 96 bits control every pixel within the image, and this is considered high dynamic range. Now, unlike the 8-bit and 16-bit images, which can take a finite number of values, 32-bit images are coded what's called floating point numbers. Slightly oversimplifying things, it means the decimal point can be put anywhere, and this means that in effect the value, the number of colors and tones is in fact unlimited. Now, how do we go about doing this? Well, the normal way is to use 3 or more images. Usually it's an odd number, 3 or 5 or 7, and many cameras will take that. Mine can take a choice of 3 or 5, and you can set how many stops between the images. Now, if we just look at this, these are 3 images from inside the cathedral at Malaga, and the so-called normal image was the one that the camera fixed the exposure, and then 2 stops darker and 2 stops lighter. And if we just take a look in photo without processing it or doing anything to it, here is the best shot that the best choice of exposure that the camera could take. But you can see the stained glass windows are hopelessly overexposed, and a lot of the really bright stuff here is way overexposed, and the shadows are really dark. Now with a raw image you can pull some of that back, but where the particularly where the highlights are burnt out, that information doesn't exist anymore, so it's no good trying to expect to recover that from a raw image. So here's 2 stops darker, and you can see that pretty much all the windows are well exposed. There's plenty of detail in all those, and the bright parts here are fine, bright parts here, bright parts here are fine. But the shadows are almost too dark to get anything back from. And here is 2 stops over. So this is 2 stops brighter than the camera wanted to do. And you can see in the shadows there's plenty of detail, but all the light parts are hopelessly burnt out. So what we do here is to merge those 3 images together. So we're going to do a new HDR merge, and we get this little box here, and we go to add, and we add the 3 images that we took. Now we've got a few choices here. The default is to automatically align the images. Now if you're on a tripod and you're using a timer or a cable release and you're 100% sure the camera didn't move at all, you can click that off. But if you're hand holding, which is entirely possible, then you want it to help you to align the images that you've taken. It gives you a choice of how to align the images. The default is perspective, and I just normally leave that ticked, but there is the option to do scale, rotate and translate. And if you are hand holding it so the camera's waggling about a bit, then I would suggest trying that to help you align the images. Automatically remove ghosts. Now it's not talking about headless people walking through the cathedral, it's talking about things that appear in one image and not in all 3, or it appears in all 3 in different places. For example, if somebody's walking across the scene, then if you don't tick that, you'll see 3 times the person walking across. Or if you're outside and it's windy and the trees and the grass is moving, you'll get fuzzy trees and fuzzy grass. So if you click it to remove the ghosts, it'll pick what it thinks you're trying to achieve and eliminate the fuzziness. Now it offers you as a default 40% noise reduction, and that seems to work just fine. If I want to reduce the noise more, I would do it later on when we're processing the final image. But if you're in a particularly noisy situation, like using a very, very high ISO or very, very dark area, then you might want to up the noise reduction a little bit here. But we'll leave it in the default. And if this is ticked, it's automatically going to tone map the HDR image. Well, we leave that tick because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to generate an HDR image. So we click OK. Now it's downloading the 3 images that we selected, and it's putting them all together. So it's picking the bits that are the best exposure out of each section of each image, and it's putting all these bits together to try and make one decent image. Now it's doing the tone mapping. This takes a few minutes because they're huge files, and even though this is a pretty fast computer, it still takes a little while. Now once it's finished, it gives you these 5 presets down the left hand side. So by default this is the so-called natural setting, and the detailed just brings out the contrast a little bit, and all this is doing is changing all these sliders on the right hand side. So it just gives you a starting point. You're not locked into these. You can change it how you want. Cool just changes the color value and puts a little bit of blue in. The high contrast black and white is really good if you're doing a mono image. dramatic, I've never ever used. I don't care for that look. I mean, some people like that, and it's become called the HDR look. But if that floats your boat, that's fine. I tend to nearly always start with detailed and then work away from that. So we can come over to the sliders here. I normally leave the tone compression at or close to 100. You can see the change that it makes. So there's no hard and fast rules. You just fiddle with it till it's how you like it. Local contrast, you can easily overdo this one, and you can see how it overemphasizes the details, in my opinion. So I would treat this with a modicum of respect, unless it's doing something that you really want to do. Now, because we're still in RAW, we can adjust the exposure, so we can maybe just turn this down a little bit. The black point is just for setting the black point if you want a particular look. I would tend to do this later in the processing. Brightness, again, I would tend to do that later, but you can make it brighter or darker as you wish here. Now on the balance, again, you can change the contrast here, but again, I would tend to do this later because I don't really like the look of that. Saturation, you can make it less saturated, you can make it more saturated, you can make it look how you want it to look. I'm just going to turn it down a little bit here. Vibrance, you can make the colors just a little bit richer. It doesn't have a huge effect on this particular photo, but you can play about with that. White balance, you can also do this later, but I would maybe just make this a little bit cooler to make it more realistic to the colors that exist. I'm not going to mess with the tint. I'm not going to mess with shadows or highlights here. Detail refinement, again, you can very easily overdo this. Let's just turn everything up a bit and you'll see you're starting to get that HDR look, but it can be handy for just adding detail to some of the stuff. So we'll just leave this turned up a little bit because it brings out the texture on these pillars quite nicely. And then when we're done, we click apply. And just before I go out, remind you that we're still in 32 bits here. So there's an infinite number of colors and tones possible. So we click apply. Now these are, again, big files, so it takes a few minutes. And now we're back into the normal photo persona. And from here we can do what we want. We can change the perspective. So we can sharpen it more, we can do anything we want. If we just want to change the perspective here to stop the pillars falling in on themselves. I would leave them pointing in a little bit, otherwise it looks a bit unnatural, and we can just straighten the bottom at the same time. And then if we crop it to get rid of the bits we've lost, I'm not going to spend much time on this because this isn't what we came for, but just to give you an idea. So that's approximating to a photo taken inside the cathedral using HDR. And again, we've got all the normal. We might just adjust the levels a bit here. So that takes us through the process of making a high dynamic range image from 3 exposures.